Hey, English 285. I wanted to talk a little bit more about Emily Dickinson to help y'all when you're doing your Emily Dickinson imitation poem assignment. Um, One of the things, we looked at a couple of specific poems in class. Um, I want to talk about some stuff in general here. Like, for instance, her use of dashes. And I don't know, we talked briefly in class about, how do you pause for a dash? Long, or is it a shorter pause than a comma, or is it a longer pause? However you want to, whatever conclusion you want to reach there is fine with me. Um, but what I want to point out is that those um, those dashes happening so frequently, to me, create a sort of sense of what might you say, like out of breathness. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog, to tell your name, the livelong June, to an admiring bog. So right, she's got dashes. That's like six dashes there in that little thing, and each one of those is a little tiny. Well, how dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog. These little tiny things. I think one of the cool things about poetry is you can sometimes see how other people's minds work, and it seems like to me that Emily Dickinson's mind works in these little breathy phrases, right? This little phrase. I felt a funeral in my brain. Um, the other thing, right? So aside from the dashes, which again, so when you're imitating Emily Dickinson, you might think about the idea that you want to da 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 ha 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 da 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 ha 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 ha. Right? You get what I'm saying? Um, Little tiny burst of thought, right? She is keeps things very minimal. Um, at any rate, so think about the dashes when you're doing your poem, and how those might be important. Um, and then I wanted to point out again the way in which she subverts her expectations. And I'm going to look at one poem in particular. But before we do that, I just want to like listen. So we've already. I heard a fly buzz when I died. And the way that when I died changes what we think of when someone says, I heard a fly buzz, we think something trivial. And then they say, when I died, all of a sudden things become very serious and it's a lot different, right? So she does a lot of this where you have a little phrase followed by another little phrase. I heard a fly buzz when I died. I died for beauty, but was scarce. I am alive, I guess. I would not paint a picture. This is hers, right? Um, After great pain, a formal feeling comes. It was not death, for I stood up. The brain is wider than the sky. Ah, ain't that great? The brain is wider than the sky. Um, right. Publication is the auction of the mind. My life had stood a loaded gun. That is probably my favorite one, right? My life had stood a loaded gun. So when you're writing your poem, right, think about how it is that she does that, particularly in the first line where she says, I went to school and saw a horse. Now that one I just made up, right? She doesn't say that, but you get the idea. Da da da, da da da. And again, the idea being here that we want to surprise ourselves. We want to be able to surprise people, even in the context of a line, not just surprise them with the whole poem, but word by word, we can surprise people. So I wanted to look quickly at one more poem here that illustrates, I think, both the idea of her subverting expectations and the use of hyphens and how hyphens are, I'm sorry, dashes and how dashes are used, um, uh, and the way in which the dashes can change the poem. So I'll link to I Felt a Funeral in My Brain below, but this is I Felt a Funeral in My Brain. Obviously, I'm reading from a book. I felt the funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating, beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as all the heavens were a bell and being but an ear, and I in silence, some strange race wrecked, solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down and hit a world at every plunge and finished knowing then. Okay, so a couple of things. Notice her rhymes: fro and through, drum and numb, soul and toll, ear and here, down and then. So we've got two places here where we've got slant rhymes, down and then, and fro and through. So again, you might want to do some slant rhyme in your poem. Other things that I want you to notice here, again, the weird capitalization that she does. How much fun it is to say, I felt a funeral, which is a weird thing to say, in my brain, makes it that much weirder. So that's a fun thing to think about. If we go through this poem, I want to point out a couple of things. Well, one, look on the left-hand margin and see the letter A. We have and in the first stanza, in the second one we have and A, and then the third one we've got and then as and and then the last one and. To me, this adding on of and makes the poem seem to sort of speed up as it goes along, as if like you're talking and you keep adding on like sort of in a hurried fashion. And this, I think of like a little kid. And then we went to the store, and then and then we bought the thing, and then we I don't know if you take it like that, but for me, that's kind of how it goes at the end, kind of and this. If we just look through this, I want to point out a few things. I felt a funeral in my brain. Mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And so it's like treading. She can hear the boom, boom. And it was so, the treading was sort of so, consistent or something, that it seemed like maybe sense was going to break through. Like maybe I'm going to understand something. And then they were all seated, and the service, like a drum, kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. And obviously the beating here, echoing the treading. And so we've got this rhythm, beating. So this time, right, the service is going on to the point that she thinks that her mind's going numb. Because, I don't know about you, but like when I was a kid in church, sometimes it just went on and on, and I thought, my God, my mind's going to go numb. And so you know what that's like. And then, this is interesting, and then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll. And so boots of lead, so they're heavy-footed, right? They're treading, they're beating, and so it's like they're wearing boots of lead. It's like I hear them lift a box and creak across my soul. So the box, I assume we think of here as a casket, but creak across my soul. So it's like her soul is a wooden floor, an old wooden floor. It's all creaky, right? And here they go. And then space began to toll, like space, like a bell ringing. And it was so loud, it was like all of heaven was a bell, and you being alive was just being an ear. So it's just a bell and an ear. That's some loud tolling. And I, in silence, some strange race wrecked, solitary here. And yet, despite the sort of loudness, and again, I think of here maybe the loudness of silence or something like that. I'm not exactly sure. It's space that's tolling. Despite this, the speaker of the poem feels isolated from it, right? Not part of the sound, in silence, listening to the sound outside or something, right? And then the plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. Okay, so a couple of things here. One, obviously the and. Two, the that, down, and then rhyme. But then notice that last line. It could just, if she didn't have any dashes in it, it could just read, and finish knowing then. And of course, we would know that that means at that moment she quit knowing. But when she writes it, and finished knowing, then that makes it seem like we could read it like and finish knowing then, or finish knowing then what? Well, in this particular case, then there's nothing, because I think that's part of the point of the poem here. So you see how using the dashes at the end, in this particular case, makes us have multiple meanings, which, can be a great fun thing. So here, right, I don't know if you get the image of a plank and reason breaking, and I drop down and down, and I think we get the image of the casket dropping into the ground, and then don't know anything anymore. But to me, what's more important here is to think about the box that's being carried across the soul, and the soul is this creaky floorboard. Okay, and what happens if your soul, if one of those creaky floorboards breaks, right? And people are walking around with their lead boots. And what if a plank and reason breaks? And so I think of, your ability to reason, our ability to reason is like a structure that we learn. Here's gravity, and here's don't touch the hot stove, and here's listen to your parents, and here's these things that are necessary for you to be able to understand what's going on in the world. And you build up your structure of reason so high, and it's so complicated that you find yourself in college reading Emily Dickinson poems. What happens if in your structure of reason a plank breaks? Well, if it's an important plank, that can be sort of the end of life. For instance, if you forget about gravity for just a second and walk off a building, well, that's the end of it. I think here in particular I worked in a halfway house for mentally ill people, and I think of a guy who was there who believed that the cops were going to arrest him for killing his mom, even though he didn't kill his mom. He's paranoid about the cops. He's paranoid about the cops. And so you would think if I could, or somebody could sit down and convince him, like, dude, you didn't kill your mom. For the most part, we know that if you didn't commit the crime, you're not going to be arrested for it. Of course, that's not always true. But for the most of us, most of the time, we know that we're not going to be arrested for something that we didn't do. And you would think if you could just convince him of that, that everything would be fine. But no, even if you convinced him of that, he would just probably switch it to some other delusion, because this is what his schizophrenia has him doing. But the point is it seems as if he just lost one plank in reason. And that plank in this particular case was the reason that says, listen, I'm not going to be held accountable for things that I didn't do. And he loses that one, and there goes his life, right? He's in and out of mental hospitals and halfway houses, sleeping under his bed, paranoid, not wanting to go outside. All of this because seemingly one sort of plank has broken. And so, in this particular case, right, I get the image of this structure, the plank breaking, and then the person dropping down and down. And once you can't trust your reason anymore, once you can't trust that your structure of reason is sound, then all of a sudden everything in the world becomes like a new world. Each and every time you can't count on anything because you can't trust your own self, right? I'm thinking like, I'm not a paranoid schizophrenic, but I have one example of feeling like a paranoid schizophrenic, which is one time in my English office, I'm walking down the hall, and there's a guy in the hall who I know but don't really know. He's a graduate student, and he's walking toward me, and I'm walking toward him, and no one else is in the hall. And we don't know each other, but we know each other enough to say hi. And when we're at the appropriate distance to say hello to each other, I raise up my head and I say, hey. And as we're walking by, he says, hey, asshole. And I stopped, literally stopped, and turned and looked, and he was still just walking down the hall. And I'm like, wow, this guy called me an asshole, and I have no idea why, and I don't even know him. This was troubling to me. So I told my wife, I'm like, oh my God, this guy called me an asshole. And she's like, oh, surely he didn't call you an asshole. I swear he did. I heard him. And then someone else in the department, I said, hey, you know so-and-so? And they're like, yeah, I know so-and-so. And I'm like, that dude called me an asshole. And they're like, he wouldn't have called you an asshole. He's a nice guy, I'm like, well, I heard him, so, maybe he's not as nice as you think. And so then, very soon, a couple days later, I see him again in the hall. And of course, this time I'm all on edge. And I say, hey. And he says, hey. And that's it. So, what do I do? Well, I'm just going to assume that that first time when I heard, hey, asshole, I must have just heard it wrong. You know, it seems unlikely that he said that to me. Everyone else says he's nice. He acted fine the second time. So I'm just going to let it go and assume that I made a mistake. But let's just say everywhere I go all day long, I'm hearing people say, hey, asshole. And everybody's telling me that that person's not telling me, hey, asshole. But that's what I hear everywhere I go. People, if that's what your life was like, you would be so freaked out. You'd be walking around with your eyes open, like, what is going on? You know how when they arrest crazy people in the newspaper and everyone says, oh, they look so crazy. Well, you would look crazy too if you were walking around scared that you can't trust your senses, where you're like, I heard them say this. And everyone else is like, no, you didn't hear that. You're like, I heard them. If you can't trust yourself, if you can't trust it, everything's like a new world. Every situation is new. That's what I take from this poem. And again, it's just beautifully done. And with the dash at the end, this to me is just super cool. And now, this poem doesn't have to be interpreted the way that I just interpreted it. As a matter of fact, there's a number of people who think of this poem as having to do with migraine headaches, that she's having headaches like a funeral in her brain. People point out the treading and the beating, and so like the throbbing of the head. That could be a way of looking at the poem and thinking about it. But for me, the thing that I enjoy thinking about with the poem is this idea of the plank and reason and what happens when it breaks. And so, anyway, hopefully this gives you more ideas about how to write your Emily Dickinson poem. I hope everyone has a great day, and if you have questions or problems, you let me know, and your poem will be due next Wednesday. Everyone, take care. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.